Close your eyes and step into the echoing corridors of a medieval castle. The torches flicker against stone walls, casting dancing shadows that seem alive in the amber light. You can hear the faint whistle of wind threading through cracks in the heavy oak doors, and somewhere in the distance, the soft clatter of servants preparing for the night. It looks romantic when you visit such places as a tourist today, but if you had to actually live here, especially on a winter's evening, you would quickly discover a harsh truth. Castles were magnificent fortresses, but they were also freezing prisons where survival itself required careful planning and no small amount of ingenuity. The reality is both simple and daunting. These stone giants were designed to repel armies, not embrace comfort. Those same thick walls that could shrug off battering rams and siege engines also trapped cold air like enormous stone refrigerators. Once the sun dropped below the horizon, the temperature inside plummeted almost as quickly as it did outside. The flagstone floors conducted chill upward through your boots, and your breath began forming clouds before your face even in the Great Hall. Medieval architects understood siegecraft and defense, but insulation was not in their vocabulary. A castle was a military machine first, and a home second, if at all. Many castles in northern Europe were strategically positioned on windswept hills and rocky outcrops. From a military perspective, this was brilliant. You could see enemies approaching from miles away, and the elevation gave you a commanding defensive advantage. But from the perspective of someone trying to get a good night's sleep, it was a curse. Wind scoured every surface, forcing icy drafts through gaps in shutters, under doors, and through arrow slits that had never been designed with comfort in mind. You couldn't ask for a worse sleeping environment if you had deliberately set out to create one. Even the fireplaces, those roaring centerpieces of medieval halls, barely warmed anything beyond their immediate vicinity. A blazing fire in the Great Hall might create a circle of tolerable heat around the hearth, but step more than 10 feet away, and you were back in what felt like a stone cellar. By the time you climbed the spiral staircase to your bed chamber, the temperature could feel more Arctic than domestic. Chroniclers from the late medieval period wrote about the shock of discovering frost forming inside bedrooms, icicles hanging from bed curtains, and wash basins frozen solid by morning. They treated this as normal, hardly worth more than a passing mention. If your chamber didn't grow a thin layer of frost on the walls by January, you were fortunate indeed. Yet despite all this, people survived. Somehow, entire generations figured out ways to keep their bodies from becoming ice sculptures during the long winter months. Part of their success lay in understanding that survival required ritual and adaptation. As night fell, entire households followed carefully developed patterns designed to trap whatever warmth they could manage. The vast castle might echo with emptiness, but the focus was always on shrinking the livable space after dark. Fires were banked with practiced skill, beds were arranged and curtained with military precision, clothes were layered until mobility became secondary to insulation, and everyone hoped the draft wouldn't be too cruel that particular night. Picture yourself walking into a medieval bed chamber. The bed itself rises like a wooden monument in the center of the room, a piece of carpentry raised high above the floor. This wasn't for show or status, though both mattered. It was pure strategy. Cold air sinks, always, and the most frigid layer hovered just above those stone floors. Even elevated, however, the bed couldn't escape the fundamental problem. The stone walls radiated chill upward, downward, and in every direction, so that no matter how many blankets you piled on top, the cold found ways to seep through from below, from the sides, and from the very air around you. The question of whether castles truly became more comfortable as the centuries passed remains hotly debated among historians. Some argue that innovations like better tapestries, improved chimneys, and thicker hangings genuinely transformed rooms into warmer spaces. Others insist this is wishful thinking, pointing out that medieval building technology simply never prioritized human comfort over military necessity. The truth probably lies somewhere in the middle. Things improved somewhat over time, but never to the level of what we would recognize as real comfort. Even in the grandest castle, winter remained a formidable enemy that demanded respect and preparation. As you settle into your imagined medieval bed, the wooden frame creaks ominously under the weight of straw-stuffed bedding. Outside, the wind moans against the battlements like some restless spirit, and the only light comes from a small oil lamp guttering bravely near the bedside. Even that fragile flame seems to struggle against the overwhelming darkness and cold. Your toes already begin to ache with that sharp, penetrating chill that medieval people knew so well, even though you're still wrapped in your daytime clothes, because removing them would have been an invitation to hypothermia. The sounds of castle nightlife filter through the thick walls and heavy doors. The distant echo of boots on stone as guards change watch, the creak of timber rafters contracting under frost, a dog barking somewhere in the courtyard below, its voice muffled and distorted by the thickness of the stone. You might even hear the slow drip of water freezing somewhere nearby, a sound that would become as familiar as your own heartbeat during the winter months. None of these sounds helps you feel any warmer. Instead, they serve as constant reminders that the world outside your bed curtains is unforgiving and hostile. It's tempting to imagine that the nobility lived in perfect comfort while peasants shivered in their humble cottages, but the reality was often more ironic than that. Sometimes the peasants actually had it better. Their homes, built of wood and daub, were small enough that a single hearth could warm the entire interior effectively. A modest fire in a one-room cottage could keep a whole family decently comfortable through the night. Meanwhile, a nobleman in his grand castle might shiver in a stone chamber so enormous that even 5 roaring fireplaces couldn't make a meaningful dent in the cold. The irony wasn't lost on contemporary observers, and surviving letters from clerics and noble visitors frequently remark on the difficulty of getting restful sleep in castles during the winter months. The Great Hall was the beating heart of castle life, especially after sunset. If the bed chambers were tombs of stone and drafts, the Great Hall was at least alive with some measure of warmth and human activity. Long trestle tables stretched across the floor, their wooden surfaces polished smooth by countless elbows and drinking vessels. The air carried the mingled scents of roasted meat, spilled ale, damp wool, and the ever-present smoke that never fully cleared from the rafters above. The fire in the central hearth roared defiantly, a brilliant square of orange heat pushing back against the creeping winter darkness. This was where castle life felt most human after the sun went down. People gathered here not only to eat and drink, but also to absorb as much warmth as possible before retreating to their icy chambers for the night. Servants darted back and forth carrying trenchers of bread, jugs of ale, and great platters of steaming pottage. Dogs scavenged hopefully underfoot, their tails wagging as they searched for scraps. The hall buzzed with laughter, song, and the cheerful clatter of knives against wooden plates. For a brief time, you could almost forget that outside the wind howled across the battlements and frost was steadily forming on the windows. The Great Hall was typically the only space in most castles where heating achieved anything approaching success. A huge open hearth dominated the center or end of the room, and in winter the fire was fed almost constantly. Entire tree trunks were sometimes hauled in to keep the flames alive, a process that required teams of servants and enormous amounts of fuel. If you had rank and status, you claimed a seat as close to the fire as possible, basking in that precious golden glow. Less fortunate souls, servants and hangers-on, shivered along the edges of the hall, wrapping themselves in cloaks and huddling together for warmth. But here's the crucial limitation that defined medieval heating. Even in this grand communal space, the warmth only traveled so far before dissipating into the vast stone interior. The farther you sat from the flames, the colder it became, until you felt as though the walls themselves were exhaling frost. Heat rose upward naturally, becoming trapped uselessly in the smoke-stained rafters, while people on the floor wrapped themselves in every available layer and pretended to be comfortable. In truth, only the lucky few nearest the fire were ever genuinely warm, while everyone else made do with whatever radiant heat managed to reach them. Feasts sometimes doubled as strategic heating sessions during the coldest months. Nobles deliberately scheduled their largest gatherings when the weather was most brutal, understanding that the combined body heat of hundreds of guests, along with the Great Hall fire, could transform the space into something approaching genuinely cozy. Some household accounts even record servants being instructed to stand closer together simply to generate additional warmth for their masters. You could say that medieval feasting was as much about survival as it was about celebration and social display. But the warm glow of the Great Hall was always temporary. When the feast finally wound down, when the minstrels packed away their instruments and the guests staggered off to their beds, the fire was inevitably allowed to burn lower. The great logs collapsed into beds of glowing embers, making a valiant last stand against the cold, while shadows grew longer and darker on the stone walls around them. That precious heat you had clung to during the evening hours dissipated with shocking speed. Within an hour or two of the hall emptying, the temperature would plummet back toward freezing, leaving the vast space as inhospitable as any other part of the castle. The transition from the great hall to your bedchamber was often the cruelest moment of the medieval day. Picture leaving the golden firelight behind, stepping into a narrow stone passage lit by a single guttering torch. The draft hits you immediately, a knife-sharp blade of cold air rushing through arrow slits and gaps around doorways. Your breath begins fogging again instantly, and the warmth you had so carefully absorbed during the evening drains away as though the castle itself were feeding on it. That dramatic shift from temporary comfort to relentless chill defined the rhythm of medieval nights. Some nobles lingered in the great hall so long that they practically slept there, pulling high-backed benches close to the dying embers rather than face the journey to their official chambers. Servants and guards often collapsed near the hearth as well, choosing to risk the sparks, smoke, and restless noise of the hall over the icy solitude of their assigned sleeping quarters. To bed down near the fire meant accepting certain discomforts, but compared to the alternative of shivering alone in a stone box above, it was often the wiser choice. The walk from warmth to cold was more than physical discomfort. It was psychological punishment, a nightly reminder that comfort in the medieval world was always temporary and fragile. People spoke of the shock lasting all night, the way that brief exposure to bitter air while moving between rooms could leave them shivering until dawn. The castle didn't just withhold warmth, it seemed to actively punish anyone who dared to think they might be comfortable. Every torch extinguished, every cup drained empty, every laugh fading into silence was another step closer to the long, cold ordeal of actually trying to sleep. When you finally reached your bedchamber, you encountered walls that were not just thick, but monumentally thick, sometimes 12 feet of solid stone separating you from the outside world. At first consideration, that sounds like protection, like an impenetrable barrier against the winter weather. But here was the fundamental irony of castle construction. Those same walls that could shrug off siege engines and battering rams also trapped cold air with ruthless efficiency. Stone holds temperature like a memory, radiating chill even when the outside air warms temporarily. Medieval builders understood how to create fortresses that could withstand human enemies, but they had no concept of insulation or thermal comfort. If you've ever stepped into a basement or root cellar in winter, you know the sensation that medieval castle dwellers faced every night. The stone absorbed cold during the day and released it steadily after dark, creating an environment that felt more like a refrigerated cave than a human dwelling. Even when fires blazed in the great hall below, even when the sun shone directly on the outer walls, the interior chambers remained stubbornly, persistently cold. Heat was simply swallowed up by the massive stone construction, leaving only the thinnest margin around immediate fire sources where human life could be sustained comfortably. Written accounts from the 13th and 14th centuries describe noble families sitting directly in front of roaring flames, cloaks pulled up over their heads like hoods, while just behind them servants stamped their feet and rubbed their hands to maintain circulation. The fire created a narrow bubble of tolerable heat, but the stone surrounding it refused to yield or soften. Step more than a few paces away from the flames, and you were immediately back in what felt like winter weather, even though you were technically indoors. One particularly vivid complaint from travelers' journals describes how castle walls actually sweated in certain weather conditions. Moisture condensed on the cold stone surfaces and ran down in steady streams, making chambers both freezing and damp simultaneously. Imagine lying in your bed listening to the steady drip, drip, drip of water hitting the floor beside you all night long. In some seasons, moss and mold actually grew on the interior surfaces of castle walls, turning bedrooms into something resembling underground caverns more than human habitations. Tapestries and wall hangings became crucial survival tools, not mere decoration. We picture grand castle walls lined with richly woven cloth depicting scenes of hunts, battles, and courtly life, but their primary function was insulation and draft protection. A heavy woolen tapestry might cut the movement of cold air significantly, creating small pockets of relatively warmer space behind the fabric. Whether they made a truly meaningful difference in room temperature, or simply provided psychological comfort, remains debated among scholars, but the fact that people invested enormous resources in them suggests they were considered essential. The psychological impact of living surrounded by cold stone was just as challenging as the physical discomfort. Medieval people wrote about dreading winter nights more than they feared hunger, illness, or even warfare. At least those other hardships eventually ended, but the cold was relentless, night after night, month after month, throughout the entire winter season. When you lived in a castle, you couldn't escape it, couldn't find relief elsewhere, couldn't even imagine what genuine warmth might feel like. That sense of imprisonment within your own home left deep marks on medieval consciousness and literature. Floors presented their own unique challenges in the battle against cold. Instead of carpets or polished wood, castle chambers were typically strewn with rushes, long grass-like plants gathered from riverbanks and wetlands. These weren't primarily decorative, though they did add a touch of green to otherwise gray stone interiors. Rather, rushes served multiple practical functions. They softened the brutal hardness of stone underfoot, absorbed spills and moisture, and most importantly, provided a crude but effective form of insulation against the chill radiating upward from the floors. Documents from the later Middle Ages describe how households renewed their rushes several times each year, laying them thick in noble halls and sleeping chambers. When freshly spread, they smelled pleasantly of the outdoors, carrying scents of grass, earth, and rivers that provided a brief reminder of warmer seasons. The plants added cushioning underfoot, muffled the sound of footsteps, and helped trap whatever small amount of warmth could be generated near floor level. For a little while after laying fresh rushes, a chamber almost felt like it contained a piece of summer. But the charm of fresh rushes was always temporary. Over weeks and months, they became fouled with food scraps, spilled beverages, and debris from daily life. Mice and insects treated the floor covering as their personal playground, and by the end of winter, the rushes could become so filthy that moralists complained about living conditions resembling stables more than human habitations. Still, even dirty rushes were preferable to bare stone when it came to insulation and basic comfort. Herbs were often sprinkled among the rushes, partly to provide pleasant fragrances that masked less appealing odors, and partly because certain plants were believed to discourage pests. Lavender, rosemary, and meadowsweet might be scattered across the floor, creating a complex mixture of scents that define the medieval indoor experience. Imagine settling into bed and catching a faint note of lavender rising from the floor, mingling with the overwhelming smells of smoke, damp wool, and tallow candles. It wouldn't make you any warmer, but it might make the night feel slightly more civilized. The effectiveness of rushes as insulation continues to be debated among historians and archaeologists. Some argue they provided meaningful warmth by creating an insulating layer between human feet and the ice-cold stone floors. Others dismiss them as largely symbolic gestures toward comfort and cleanliness, pointing out that most heat loss in medieval chambers came from walls and inadequate roofing rather than floors. The truth likely varied depending on the thickness of the rush layer, the season, and the particular construction of individual buildings. When it came to staying warm in bed, fabric became the primary weapon in the medieval arsenal against cold. Wool, linen, and fur were layered in carefully calculated combinations until sleepers resembled human cocoons more than anything we would recognize as normal bedtime attire. Household inventories make it clear that textiles were not luxury items but essential survival equipment. Linen sheets provided the foundation layer, smooth and clean against the skin, though they offered minimal insulation on their own. Above the linen came thick woolen blankets, often so heavy that people compared their weight to having a large dog lying across the bed. These blankets were woven tightly and felted to create dense, warm layers that could trap body heat effectively. For those with sufficient wealth, fur coverlets added another layer of insulation. Fox, sable, and even bear pelts were sewn together into magnificent bed coverings that provided both warmth and unmistakable status markers. Nobles sometimes invested the equivalent of a peasant family's annual income into their bed linens and furs. An amusing detail that appears in several medieval sources suggests that some people became so heavily layered in bedclothes that they could barely move once tucked in for the night. Imagine being swaddled in 5 or 6 thick blankets, so tightly wrapped that turning over required considerable effort and risked pulling the covers loose, thereby allowing precious warm air to escape. Comfort came at the direct cost of mobility, but most people considered this a reasonable trade during the coldest months. Fur deserves special attention as both practical insulation and social symbol. Beyond its obvious luxury associations, fur provided genuinely superior warmth compared to woven textiles. Arctic fox pelts, marten skins, and sheepskin linings all created dense layers of insulation that could mean the difference between surviving a cold night and genuinely suffering. One chronicler describes a noble woman who refused to travel anywhere without her ermine-lined bed coverings, even in summer, because she feared the shock of cold chambers and unfamiliar castles. Some households developed elaborate theories about layering different types of fabric for maximum warmth and health benefits. Certain people believed that sleeping under too much linen was actually unhealthy because linen was thought to draw heat away from the body. To counteract this, they deliberately created textile sandwiches, with linen touching the skin, wool or fur above and below, creating what they hoped would be the perfect combination of cleanliness, warmth, and comfort. The bed itself was far more than a simple piece of furniture. A proper medieval bed was an elaborate machine designed to create a small, livable microclimate within an otherwise hostile stone chamber. When you drew back the heavy curtains of a 4-poster bed, you weren't just accessing someone's private sleeping space. You were entering a carefully engineered survival system that could mean the difference between a tolerable night and genuine misery. Detailed household inventories from noble estates showed just how important these great beds were to medieval life. Unlike the simple pallets and straw mattresses used by peasants, aristocratic beds rose high off the ground, their frames carved from oak or walnut and built to last for generations. The 4 posts stretched upward to support a wooden canopy, and from this frame hung heavy curtains that could be drawn completely closed, creating a small room within the larger chamber. The canopy and curtains weren't merely decorative elements, though they certainly served to display wealth and status. Their primary function was practical. By enclosing the sleeping area, they trapped body heat, breath warmth, and whatever radiant heat might rise from braziers or bed warmers. Think of it as a medieval tent pitched inside your bedroom. Once the curtains were drawn tight, the temperature difference between the enclosed bed and the open chamber could be dramatic, perhaps the difference between shivering misery and actual sleep. There are records of wealthy nobles traveling with their beds, having them dismantled and loaded onto carts whenever they moved from one castle to another. This wasn't mere luxury or vanity, the bed was literally life support equipment. To sleep in an unfamiliar castle without your own canopy and curtains was to risk a night of genuine suffering from cold. The bed was as essential to noble travel as horses, armor, or weapons. Some accounts describe bed curtains being treated with wax or lined with oilcloth to make them more effective at blocking drafts. Imagine pulling these curtains closed around you, the fabric heavy and slightly stiff, smelling faintly of beeswax or linseed oil, blocking not just cold air but also light and sound. They created a sense of private space in chambers that were rarely truly private, and offered psychological as well as physical comfort in the vast, echoing chambers of medieval castles. The effectiveness of these enclosed beds continues to generate discussion among historians. Did they genuinely provide meaningful warmth, or do later romantic depictions exaggerate their comfort? Archaeological evidence suggests that the curtains were indeed thick and carefully constructed, so there's good reason to believe they worked as intended. However, some scholars argue that much of their value was psychological, the feeling of being enclosed, protected, and hidden away from the intimidating vastness of cold stone chambers. Beneath all those layers of curtains and blankets lay the foundation of medieval sleep, the mattress itself. What supported your body during the night could determine whether you woke rested or aching, warm or frozen. Medieval bedding came in several forms, but 2 types dominated: the feather bed for the wealthy, and the straw tick for everyone else. A feather bed was the ultimate medieval luxury for sleeping comfort. Picture sinking into a thick sack stuffed with goose or duck feathers, soft and yielding, cradling your body while providing excellent insulation. Well-maintained feather beds could be so thick that they raised sleepers nearly a foot above the bed frame, creating a bouncy, warm cushion that made cold stone chambers almost bearable. Noble families treasured these possessions, often passing them down through generations and carefully maintaining them with fresh feathers and new ticking. However, feather beds came with their own problems. They could be so soft that sleepers sank too deeply, struggling to change position during the night. Some people complained of feeling suffocated by the thickness of the feathers, particularly when combined with heavy woolen blankets and enclosed bed curtains. One amusing letter from the 15th century describes a guest who compared his host's feather bed to being swallowed by a goose, suggesting that excessive softness could become as uncomfortable as inadequate cushioning. For most people, the reality was a straw tick, a large cloth sack filled with straw, hay, or dried reeds. These humble mattresses were cheap to produce, easy to refill when they flattened, and reasonably effective at lifting sleepers off the ice-cold stone floors. Peasants used them universally, soldiers slept on them in barracks, and even noble households used straw ticks in servants' quarters and guest rooms of lower status. Straw ticks came with significant drawbacks. The filling compressed quickly under body weight, creating uncomfortable lumps and hollow sharp pieces of straw poked through the cloth covering, scratching sleepers throughout the night. Mice and other vermin made homes in the straw, and fleas thrived in a warm, dark environment. Households had to beat their straw mattresses regularly, literally whacking them with wooden paddles to redistribute the filling and drive out pests. Contemporary sources mention the practice of mixing herbs into straw filling, both to improve the smell and to discourage insects. Lavender, mint, or pennyroyal might be scattered through the straw, providing brief periods of pleasant fragrance before the herbs dried out and lost their potency. Even with these improvements, however, straw mattresses remained humble, practical solutions to the basic need for something softer than stone floors. The question of how widespread feather beds really were continues to generate scholarly debate. Some historians argue they remained rare luxuries reserved for the highest levels of medieval society. Others point to inventory records suggesting that even moderate households might own at least one feather bed for the master and mistress, while using straw ticks for children and servants. The evidence is incomplete, but what's clear is that sleeping surfaces mattered enough to be carefully recorded in wills and household accounts. Even the most carefully constructed bed, with its curtains, feather mattress, and piles of woolen blankets, couldn't guarantee survival during the coldest nights purely through passive insulation. What often made the crucial difference between tolerable sleep and genuine misery was companionship, the simple biological fact that multiple bodies generate more heat than a single person can produce alone. Noble families understood this principle well, though they rarely discussed it openly in their formal writings. Servants often slept in small adjoining rooms or even on pallets placed at the foot of the master's bed. While these arrangements were officially about security and service, they also served the practical function of adding extra bodies to heat the sleeping space. Even a few additional people in a chamber could raise the temperature by several precious degrees during the coldest winter nights. Medieval monasteries provide clear examples of communal sleeping for warmth. Monks slept in long rows of simple beds arranged in drafty stone dormitories, their proximity creating whatever warmth could be generated by shared body heat. The same principle applied in military barracks, where soldiers huddled together under whatever blankets and cloaks they could obtain. These arrangements weren't primarily about companionship or social bonding, they were about survival through the efficient sharing of body heat. Animals played an important role in medieval sleeping arrangements, particularly dogs. Large hunting hounds were not just security measures and status symbols, they were living heating systems. A couple of mastiffs or wolfhounds curled up at the foot of the bed could transform an unbearably cold night into something tolerable. The phrase three-dog night, though it comes from much later folklore, captures an essential medieval reality. The number of dogs you needed in bed was directly related to how cold the weather had become. Travelers' accounts record instances of guests sleeping in stables with horses, sheep, and cattle rather than in the supposedly superior human accommodations upstairs. Large animals generate substantial body heat, and a stable full of livestock could be significantly warmer than an empty chamber, despite the obvious drawbacks in terms of smell and cleanliness. For people facing genuine cold, warmth trumped dignity every time. Bed sharing among humans was far more common and socially acceptable in medieval times than it would be today. Families routinely piled together parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes trusted servants, forming tangles of limbs and shared blankets under whatever covering they could obtain. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford when survival was at stake. The psychological comfort of human companionship combined with the practical benefits of shared body heat to make crowded sleeping arrangements preferable to cold solitude. Medieval clothing practices around sleep differed significantly from modern customs. Rather than changing into specialized nightwear or sleeping nude, medieval people often went to bed wearing almost as many layers as they had worn during the day. This wasn't simply because they lacked dedicated sleeping garments, though that was sometimes true for poorer families. Rather, clothing itself became part of the integrated system of surviving cold nights. The basic garment for sleep was the nightshirt, a long, loose linen tunic that resembled an oversized undergarment. Linen was the preferred fabric because it was relatively easy to wash compared to wool, and it felt smooth against the skin rather than scratchy. Over the nightshirt, depending on the severity of the cold, sleepers might add a woolen tunic, a cloak, or even multiple layers of whatever warm clothing they possessed. The principle was straightforward: more layers meant better survival odds. One particularly important element of medieval sleepwear was the nightcap or coif, a close-fitting cloth cap that covered the head and often tied under the chin. This wasn't a fashion statement but a recognition of basic body heat dynamics. Medieval people understood that significant amounts of body heat escaped through the head, making an uncovered skull a serious liability during cold nights. A properly fitted nightcap could make the difference between comfortable sleep and hours of shivering. Medieval medical texts sometimes recommended binding the extremities, feet, hands, and ankles in strips of linen or wool before sleep. This practice recognized that fingers and toes were most vulnerable to cold injury, and that keeping them covered and insulated was essential for both comfort and health. People wrapped themselves like medical patients, but the bandaging was purely practical protection against the relentless cold of stone chambers. Modesty also played a role in medieval sleeping attire. In a world where bed sharing was common and privacy rare, being partially clothed or naked was socially unacceptable. Even married couples were typically depicted in manuscript illustrations wearing caps and long shirts while in bed together. Nightclothes served social and moral functions as well as practical ones, maintaining propriety even in the intimate setting of the bedchamber. The ritual of preparing for bed involved layering up rather than down, adding cloth rather than removing it, creating as much insulation as possible before attempting to sleep. This process was the opposite of our modern association of nightwear with relaxation and minimal clothing. For medieval sleepers, getting ready for bed meant armoring themselves with fabric against the 8-hour siege of cold that lay ahead. Before slipping under the covers, many medieval households employed one more ingenious tool against the cold: the warming pan. Picture a servant approaching your bed carrying a long-handled brass pan filled with glowing coals. The metal surface radiated heat, and small perforations allowed the warmth to escape while containing the burning embers safely. This simple device could transform a bed from feeling like a block of ice into something approaching human habitability. The warming pan ritual was both practical and theatrical. The servant would slide the device methodically back and forth between the bed sheets, the coals inside crackling and hissing while filling the chamber with the scent of hot metal and wood ash. Steam would rise as moisture evaporated from the bedding, and for several minutes the bed would actually feel warm to the touch. Without this preparation, climbing into cold sheets meant enduring an hour or more of shivering while your own body heat gradually warmed the bedding. Household inventories from wealthy estates list warming pans alongside other essential nighttime equipment like candlesticks and chamber pots. They weren't exotic luxuries but standard tools expected in any well-managed household during winter months. By the late Middle Ages, castle chambers without warming pans were considered either improperly equipped or occupied by people of insufficient social status to merit such care. However, warming pans carried genuine hazards. Letters and chronicles contain complaints about bed sheets being scorched or actually set on fire when servants left the warming pan in one place too long or when the coals were too hot. Picture waking up to discover smoking holes in your expensive linen, or worse, flames spreading across your bed curtains in a chamber full of dry rushes and wooden furniture. Such accidents were serious matters that could easily turn fatal. Some households added aromatic herbs directly to the coals before warming the bed, believing that the resulting fragrant smoke would purify the air and ward off disease. The practice combined practical heating with medieval medical theory and superstition, creating a nightly ritual that addressed both physical and spiritual concerns about health and safety during the vulnerable hours of sleep. The warming pan was never intended to keep you comfortable all night long. Rather, it provided just enough initial heat to make the transition from waking to sleeping bearable. The warmth it generated faded quickly, usually within an hour, but by then your own body heat and the insulating properties of blankets and bed curtains had hopefully taken over the task of maintaining tolerable temperatures until morning. Beyond physical preparations for warmth, medieval people also turned to spiritual and supernatural protection against the dangers of cold nights. The medieval worldview saw winter darkness as genuinely dangerous, not just physically uncomfortable but spiritually threatening as well. Cold air itself was suspected of carrying illness and evil influences, making protective rituals as important as blankets and fires for ensuring safe sleep. One widespread practice involved hanging protective amulets above or near the bed. These might be simple wooden crosses, small religious relics, or cloth pouches filled with herbs believed to have protective properties. Rue, mugwort, and juniper were popular choices, thought to drive away both evil spirits and the potentially poisonous night air. Imagine lying in bed beneath a canopy decorated with fragrant bundles of herbs, their scent mingling with the smoke from the hearth and the mustiness of wool blankets. Prayers formed another essential layer of protection. Monastic roles encouraged brothers to recite psalms before lying down, and noble families often repeated formal prayers at the bedside. Even peasants whispered traditional charms and invocations, half prayer and half spell, as they crossed themselves against the threats of frost, fever, and supernatural danger. Parents routinely murmured protective verses over their children, pressing kisses to small foreheads to ward off the night hag, a figure blamed for suffocating sleepers in their beds. Iron objects played a special role in medieval bedroom protection. Knives, scissors, or other metal implements were often placed beneath beds or pillows, based on the belief that iron repelled demons, fairies, and other supernatural entities that might slip into rooms during the dark hours. The metal would catch occasional glints from the firelight, serving as a silent guard against invisible intruders that were considered as real and dangerous as any human enemy. Folk beliefs developed around specific practices for retaining body heat through spiritual means. One tradition insisted that turning your shoes upside down beside the bed would prevent frost from biting your toes during the night. Another claimed that whispering the names of 3 saints before extinguishing your bedside candle would ensure that your body heat would not flee while you slept. To modern minds these sound like harmless superstitions, but to medieval people they were practical strategies as vital as extra blankets. The rituals surrounding medieval sleep reveal how vulnerable people felt during the night hours, when cold, disease, and spiritual dangers all seemed to intensify. Physical preparations alone weren't considered sufficient protection. You also needed spiritual armor in the form of prayers, charms, and traditional practices that connected you to divine protection and community wisdom about survival. Castle architecture itself evolved in small ways to make chambers more livable, though always within the constraints of military necessity. One innovation was the solar, a private room typically reserved for the lord's family and positioned to take advantage of whatever sunlight might be available. Unlike the cavernous Great Hall, solars were deliberately smaller and therefore easier to heat effectively. They usually included their own fireplace, thick wall hangings, and windows positioned to catch morning or afternoon sun. Tapestries became far more than decorative elements in these improved chambers. Woven from wool or silk, they lined walls with scenes of saints, hunts, and mythical creatures, but their primary function was insulation. A heavy tapestry might measure 20 feet wide and require several servants to hang properly. Behind these textile barriers, the damp stone was hidden, and the air near the walls became noticeably less frigid. Whether tapestries made a genuine difference in room temperature or simply provided psychological comfort remains debated, but nobles invested enormous sums in them, suggesting they were considered essential rather than optional. Wooden paneling served similar purposes, creating buffer zones between human occupants and the relentlessly cold stone walls. Oak boards were fitted carefully, and servants stuffed gaps with tow, moss, or rags to eliminate drafts. The result was imperfect but represented a significant improvement over bare stone surfaces. Some nobles transported their finest tapestries from castle to castle, treating them as portable architectural elements rather than mere decorations. The sensory experience of a well-appointed medieval chamber was complex and layered. The rough weave of tapestries beneath your fingertips, the faint smell of lanolin from wool hangings, the sound of wind muffled but not eliminated by thick fabric barriers. You could almost convince yourself that such a room offered genuine refuge from the cold, though the fundamental chill lurked just beyond the decorative defenses. Even peasants adopted simpler versions of these strategies. Instead of expensive woven tapestries, they hung coarse cloth or patched fabric to reduce drafts in their humble cottages. Bright painted designs on simple materials served the dual function of insulation and decoration, proving that the desire to make cold spaces more livable transcended social boundaries. Medieval sleep was rarely uninterrupted by modern standards. People didn't expect to collapse into unconsciousness for 8 straight hours and wake refreshed. Instead, they lived with what historians call segmented sleep, a pattern where the night was divided into 2 distinct periods of rest separated by a period of quiet wakefulness. This wasn't considered abnormal or problematic, but was simply the natural rhythm of human sleep in an era without artificial lighting. The first sleep typically lasted from shortly after sunset until around midnight. Then many people would wake naturally, spending an hour or 2 in quiet activity before returning to a second sleep that carried them until dawn. During this wakeful interval, they might tend fires, check on children or animals, engage in prayer or meditation, or simply lie quietly in the darkness. For people living in frigid castles, this middle-of-the-night awakening often revolved around the practical necessity of maintaining fires. Without constant attention, even the best banked fires would die during the long winter nights, leaving chambers to become dangerously cold. Someone had to wake, stumble across icy floors, and add fuel to keep the embers alive. This wasn't seen as an interruption of sleep but as a natural and necessary part of the nightly routine. The person on fire duty would blow gently on the coals, add carefully selected kindling, and pray that the flames would catch and spread warmth back into the room. Monasteries institutionalized this pattern with bells that called monks to prayer at regular intervals throughout the night. These nighttime offices ensured that someone was always awake to maintain fires and watch for emergencies, while also serving the spiritual purpose of marking the hours with worship. The practice demonstrates how medieval people integrated practical survival needs with religious observance in ways that seem foreign to modern sensibilities. The ritual of night fire tending had its own sensory signature. The soft crunch of bare feet on rushes, the whisper of breath coaxing reluctant flames to life, the gradual brightening of the chamber as new wood caught fire. The person tending the fire would feel the gradual return of warmth to hands and face while knowing that their vigilance meant survival for everyone sleeping nearby. Food and drink played crucial roles in the medieval strategy for surviving cold nights. What you consumed before attempting sleep could mean the difference between tolerable rest and hours of shivering misery. During winter, households relied heavily on thick, warming foods that would provide lasting heat from within the body. Pottages, dense stews of barley, peas, and root vegetables were simmered slowly in great cauldrons, creating meals that clung to the ribs and generated internal warmth for hours. Noble households enriched their evening meals with meat, imported spices, and cream, while peasants made do with onions, cabbage, and whatever scraps could be obtained. The principle was the same regardless of social status: fill the stomach with dense, warming food that would help the body maintain temperature during the cold hours ahead. Hot food wasn't just nourishment but a form of internal insulation that worked from the inside out. Warm beverages were equally important. Ale served heated was consumed by rich and poor alike, providing both calories and liquid comfort. Spiced wine, or apocryphs, became a particular favorite among nobles, wine heated gently and seasoned with cinnamon, ginger, and expensive imported cloves. The combination of alcohol, sugar, and warming spices created a drink that seemed to spread heat throughout the body, making the prospect of cold beds somewhat more bearable. Medieval medical theories supported these practices through the doctrine of the four humors. Physicians believed that cold, damp conditions could upset the body's internal balance, making warming foods and drinks actual medical necessities rather than simple comforts. Hot mead was prescribed for preventing chill from entering the bones, while heated milk with honey was recommended for soothing the stomach and maintaining healthy humoral balance during sleep. The most vulnerable members of medieval households, children and the elderly, required special attention and protection during cold nights. Their bodies, less capable of generating and retaining heat, faced genuine life-threatening challenges that healthy adults could survive with mere discomfort. Child mortality rates during winter months reflected this harsh reality, and families developed specific strategies for protecting their youngest and oldest members. Children were rarely given their own sleeping chambers but were clustered together in nurseries, servants' quarters, or family beds where shared body heat could keep them warm. Young pages and squires destined for nightly training often bunked together in crowded rooms, their natural energy and body heat combining to create tolerable sleeping conditions. The logic was brutally practical. More young bodies meant better survival odds for everyone. Infants required the most intensive protection, often sleeping directly with their mothers or in cradles positioned as close to fires as safety permitted. Swaddling wasn't just about restraining infant movement but about creating multiple layers of insulation around tiny bodies that couldn't generate sufficient heat on their own. Some chronicles describe elaborate arrangements where babies were surrounded by heated stones, placed in beds lined with furs, or even kept in kitchens where ovens provided residual warmth throughout the night. The elderly faced similar vulnerabilities. Aging bodies produced less internal heat and tolerated cold poorly, making special accommodations necessary for grandparents and aged relatives. In peasant households, the oldest family members typically claimed spots closest to the fire, while younger adults accepted colder positions. Some noble families moved elderly relatives into smaller chambers or even relocated them to kitchens during the harshest months, prioritizing survival over social propriety. Medieval medical texts reveal that physicians recognized the special vulnerability of the very young and very old. Heated stones wrapped in cloth were specifically recommended for placement at the feet of children and elders. Warm drinks were prescribed not as luxuries but as medical necessities for maintaining life in bodies that struggled to regulate temperature naturally. The medical establishment understood that sudden chills could literally extinguish the flame of life in vulnerable individuals. This focus on protecting the most vulnerable reveals both the harsh realities of medieval life and the depth of family and community care that developed in response to those challenges. Every blanket shared with a child, every heated stone placed near an elderly relative, every decision to crowd together rather than sleep alone represented a choice between individual comfort and collective survival. The olfactory landscape of a medieval bedchamber was as distinctive as its visual and tactile elements. To understand how people slept in castles, you must imagine not just what they saw and felt but what they smelled with every breath throughout the long winter nights. The air carried a complex mixture of scents that defined the medieval indoor experience as powerfully as cold stone walls or flickering firelight. Smoke dominated every interior space where fires burned. Without efficient chimneys or proper ventilation, the byproducts of combustion drifted back into living areas, depositing soot on walls and permeating every fabric surface. Fresh linens quickly absorbed the acrid tang of wood smoke, while clothing, hair, and skin carried the smell as a permanent signature of indoor life. Even the finest castle chambers reeked of smoke in ways that would be intolerable to modern sensibilities. Damp wool contributed its own distinctive odor to the medieval bedroom atmosphere. Blankets, cloaks, and clothing were rarely completely dry during winter months, as moisture crept through stone walls and condensed on cold surfaces throughout the castle. Wool retains that heavy, lanolin-rich smell when damp, creating an earthy, slightly sour background note that mixed with smoke and other chamber scents. The combination was both comforting in its familiarity and overwhelming in its intensity. Straw and rushes added their own aromatic contributions to the medieval sleeping environment. Floor coverings released grassy, earthy scents when fresh, But these pleasant notes quickly gave way to mustier odors as the materials became trampled, soiled, and colonized by mice and insects. Straw mattresses exhaled similar smells, initially sweet and hay-like, but growing sour and stale as they absorbed sweat and body oils over weeks and months of use. Human odors were simply accepted facts of medieval life. Bathing was infrequent, clothing was worn for extended periods, and multiple people often shared sleeping spaces. The concentrated scent of bodies, leather, and unwashed wool created an atmosphere that was tolerated because it was universal rather than exceptional. To complain about such smells would have been like complaining about the existence of stone walls or winter weather. Households attempted to counter unpleasant odors through various strategies. Dried herbs scattered among rushes provided temporary relief. Rosemary, lavender, and meadowsweet were popular choices that created brief periods of pleasant fragrance before wilting and being overwhelmed by stronger, more persistent smells. Incense burned in braziers added sweetness to the air in noble chambers, though it often mixed oddly with smoke and created rather than eliminated complex aromatic combinations. The sensory reality of medieval sleep included learning to breathe this thick, layered atmosphere night after night. Your nose would gradually adjust to the combination of smoke, damp wool, straw, sweat, herbs, and whatever cooking odors drifted up from kitchens below. The smell became part of home, part of identity, part of the basic sensory signature that defined medieval indoor life. Perfumes and scented oils occasionally provided relief for those who could afford such luxuries. Nobles might dab rose water on linens or burn expensive aromatics in their chambers, creating small pockets of pleasant scent within the larger olfactory landscape. However, even the wealthiest households could not escape the fundamental reality that medieval indoor air was heavy, complex, and redolent with the byproducts of survival in cold, damp, stone buildings. As dawn approached and the longest nights finally began to yield to weak winter sunlight, medieval sleepers faced the daily challenge of emerging from their carefully constructed cocoons of warmth into the harsh reality of cold chambers. The transition from sleep to wakefulness was often brutal, requiring both physical courage and practical strategy to survive the shock of leaving bed. Frost frequently decorated the interior walls of castle chambers, creating delicate patterns of ice crystals that would have been beautiful if they hadn't represented such uncomfortable sleeping conditions. Wash basins often froze solid overnight, requiring servants to break ice before anyone could clean their face or hands. Bed curtains might be stiff with frozen condensation from sleepers' breath, creating a tinkling sound when disturbed. The psychological impact of waking to such conditions was significant. Medieval people wrote about dreading the moment when they would have to leave the relative warmth of their beds and face the icy air of their chambers. Some described feeling trapped by their own blankets, desperately wanting to remain cocooned but knowing that duties and necessities required them to brave the cold. Servants faced particular hardships as they were typically responsible for rekindling fires, preparing warm water, and making chambers habitable before their masters awoke. Picture the courage required to slip from whatever rough bedding was available, pad barefoot across frozen stone floors, and coax new life from banked embers while your breath formed clouds in the frigid air. The daily rhythm of medieval castle life was fundamentally shaped by the cycle of fighting cold each evening and recovering from it each morning. Every sunrise brought relief from the night's siege, while every sunset promised renewed battle against the elements. This pattern created a heightened appreciation for warmth, light, and the simple pleasure of being comfortable that is difficult for modern people to fully understand. The medieval experience of sleep was never passive or effortless. It required preparation, vigilance, and considerable ingenuity to survive the night in conditions that would challenge even well-equipped modern campers. Every blanket, every shared bed, every banked fire, every prayer whispered in the darkness represented humanity's ongoing struggle against the relentless forces of cold and discomfort. Yet people endured, adapted, and even thrived within these constraints. They developed rich cultures of storytelling around winter fires, created beautiful textiles that served practical as well as aesthetic purposes, and built communities united by shared challenges and mutual dependence. The harsh necessities of surviving cold nights fostered intimacy, cooperation, and resilience that shaped medieval society in fundamental ways. Medieval sleep was ultimately about more than individual survival. It was about community, ingenuity, and the human capacity to find comfort and meaning even under the most challenging circumstances. Every technique for staying warm, every ritual for protection, every shared blanket was a testament to medieval people's determination to not merely survive but to maintain their humanity in the face of an often hostile environment. As you imagine yourself settling into that long-ago bed, surrounded by the sounds, smells, and sensations of medieval night, remember that you are witnessing one of humanity's most fundamental challenges. The simple act of sleeping safely through a winter night required cooperation, innovation, and courage that connected individual survival to larger questions of community, faith, and the meaning of home itself. The story of medieval sleep is ultimately the story of human resilience, of people who faced conditions that would defeat many modern individuals, yet found ways not just to survive but to create rich, meaningful lives within those constraints. Every night they won a small victory against the cold, and every morning they arose ready to face another day in their magnificent, uncomfortable, utterly fascinating stone fortresses against the world.